Thanks for joining us.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field. And now, please welcome your host.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And we're back. Are American Jews in danger? Are we in trouble? Well, we're going to be speaking with activist Jay Ruderman, the author of the recently released book, Find Your Fight, Make Your Voice Heard for the Cause that Matter the Most. He's the host of the All About Change podcast, president of the Ruderman Family Foundation, and he has an ambitious approach to dealing with inclusion, disability rights, both nationally and in the state of Israel. Jay, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Zev. Pleasure being here.
Yeah, so much to talk about because we live in such crazy, dangerous times. I know you're a proud American Jew. You live in Israel and you fight for inclusion, especially for special needs and disabilities, both here and in Israel. Are you concerned, being an American Jew, that we're facing danger and trouble across the country? I know I'm speaking to you in Boston. I'm in New York City, but it's not just New York, but it's all over the country we're finding problems.
Yeah, so it's funny, I just came back from Israel, and obviously the threats being faced in Israel are existential, and, there's been tremendous physical damage, emotional damage. Many people have been killed. You can't really compare it, but, spending time in Boston, the leadership of the state is actively anti-Israel. It's a small Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish community. Our major Jewish supermarket had a brick thrown through the window last week. Yes, I think the rhetoric out there is leading people to physically take violent actions against property and against people. And I'm concerned.
Well, and it's also, even there are some Jewish leadership, like Jewish mayors or other Jewish elected officials, they're part of the problem. I understand there was a situation with an exhibit about the Nakba at a publicly funded library.
Yeah, so in Newton, Massachusetts, which is a city adjacent to Boston, the mayor and the librarian decided to have an exhibit on the Nakba.
That's a Jewish mayor, correct?
Yes. That was specifically the person behind it, the photographer, was anti-Israel. They put up the exhibit. The Israeli community, the IAC, came out and said, okay, well, you put this up. We don't think it's fair, but we'd like to put up an exhibit about October 7th. And the response was, nope, too political. And I had a conversation with the mayor. I said, listen, you understand you're heating up the situation in one of the largest Jewish communities in Massachusetts, and this will lead to violence. And there was violence a few months later, and someone was shot. And I think that rather than our leadership tamping down the rhetoric, it's being, it's rising up, and it's causing real problems for the Jewish community and real anxiety.
Is there leadership that's really fighting what's going on? Because, for example, this library should have been sued.
There are, yes, I would say the organized Jewish community, the Federation, the IAC, the Israeli community, they are fighting up. They are speaking out. They're not always successful, but there is a voice out there in support of Israel and support of the Jewish community.
But you're concerned with all these incidents. Is it safe for Jews to be in America?
I think it's safe for Jews to be in certain places in America. For example, I just bought a house in Florida, and I'm someone who's a Bostonian. I was born in Boston. My father was born in Boston. The same doctor that delivered my father delivered me. And I haven't changed. The state has changed. And I think that, we have a problem with politics in our country. I'll give you an example. One of our senators has been in office for 49 years. He was elected when I was 10 years old, and he's going to run for re-election again. He was elected by the Jewish community in the city of Malden. When Joe Kennedy, who's a congressman, ran against him, he decided to go with the progressive side of the Democratic Party and has consistently been anti-Israel since then. So I think that there's a problem with the politics in some states. In other states, things seem to be better. But, you know, the history, Zev, of the Jews is Jews always move when things are uncomfortable. You fight, you stand your ground, but when it becomes untenable, when it becomes dangerous, then people move. And I'll give you one example. Like, my grandmother grew up in Dorchester. It's a section of Boston. Used to be Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan was the Jewish section of the city of Boston. There are no Jews that live there anymore. And I've asked older people, like, why did you move? And they said it became dangerous. It became uncomfortable. So they moved to a different, you know, a suburb or a different section of the city. And that's our history. We're always moving. And I think society should realize that when you lose your Jews, societies never prosper once the Jews leave. You know, I was recently in Berlin, and, you know, the expulsion of the intellectual leadership prior to the Holocaust, you know, people like Albert Einstein, German universities have never recovered from that. So, you know, I know the trend is now against Israel. Anti-Semitism is in vogue. Anti-Zionism is in vogue. But it will. Societies will pay a price for that.
You know, I know you have students, you have kids that are students in college, and I believe that 73% of Jewish students experience anti-Semitism since October 7th, and comfort levels dropped from 63.7% to 38.6%. I know some colleges like Barnard and Columbia and NYU don't want Jewish students anymore. Of course, they can't say that, and they can't say, well, we're going to be selective, but they said, we want to be more inclusive. We want more people to come from around the United States, less from New York, which means less Jews. And unfortunately, getting away with that, but it's a double-edged sword. Jews feel uncomfortable being students on campus, and the colleges don't really want them.
Right. Well, I can tell you, my daughter's at Barnard, and she just finished her first year. It's a different college experience than what I had. Her friends are all Orthodox Jewish girls. They spend their time at Chabad or Hillel. They associate with each other. They don't have a lot of other connections, you know, in the school. And, you know, my daughter has told me numerous stories about her sitting on the steps outside and a bunch of pro-Palestinian kids coming around her. She had a sticker of the flag of Israel on her computer, on her laptop. And, you know, they were trying to intimidate her. She decided to rush the sororities, and the sororities blackballed any Jewish girl who was outwardly Jewish or associated with Israel. And that's now going through the whole process with the university, and they're investigating it. But it's a different college experience. You know, can people go there? Sure. Is it a comfortable experience? No, I don't think it is.
I might have a daughter in Barnard as well. And in fact, last year she was speaking out against what was happening on campus, forced her in that position. But you have an uncomfortable situation on college campuses. And what can we do? I know you're an activist and your book is about activism. What can the average person do when they confront with these situations?
So my book, called Find Your Fight, is partly my story, but the story of dozens of other people. It's about how to be an effective activist. So yes, you have to call attention to your cause, whatever your cause may be. And there are thousands of causes that people are involved in. And in fact, my podcast, All About Change, every 2 weeks, we interview an activist who's doing something different. But activism has to be effective. It can't be, first of all, it can't be violent. It can't be hateful. You have to know what you're talking about, and you have to be very focused on what your objective is. But then you have to move at some point from being yelling about your cause or demonstrating about your cause to actually working with people that can change policy. And that's not what's being done with activism right now. There's people are taking to the streets, there's hateful rhetoric, there's violence happening, but it's not changing policy. And my book talks about, well, my example happens to take place in Hollywood, where I'm a Bostonian. I'm not from the West Coast. I'm not from the Hollywood community. And I began to criticize movies that were inauthentically portraying people with disabilities. But at some point, after I got a lot of media attention around this issue, I switched to going to the studios and say, listen, you need to open your auditions to actors with disabilities. There needs to be more authentically disabled people in your films and TV. And I was able to do that by connecting with allies who were very connected with the industry, people like Peter Farrelly, and and get to the heads of the studios, and CBS and Sony and Paramount and NBC Universal actually changed their policies and opened their auditions. So that's an instance where, okay, first I wouldn't say taking to the streets, but I was certainly taking to the media and holding Hollywood's feet to the fire. But then I switched and said, okay, now I'm going to work with you to actually effectuate change. That's the missing part. And that's what the book does. The book sort of walks you through how to be a more effective activist. And I would urge anyone who's involved in any activism to pick up a copy of the book. And, it's not a blueprint, but there's something in it for everyone. And there's stories and there's lessons, and you'll take something away from it that will make you more effective at what you're doing.
We're speaking with activist Jay Ruderman, the author of the recent released book. You just heard him talking about it. Find your fight, make your voice heard for the causes that matter most. He's a host of the All About Change podcast, president of the Ruderman Family Foundation, and he's involved very heavily, of course, to become a leader. He's a leader in inclusion, disability rights, both here and in Israel. And he's not afraid to challenge Hollywood, as you heard him just talk about that, where he got more inclusion for those that were excluded. When it comes to Jews, by the way, we're feeling more excluded. Look at New York City. I wanted to get your reaction to the fact that you have a socialist communist, Mandamni, who is won the Democratic nomination, who's anti-Israel. He's pro-Hamas, pro-Intifada, and he's getting traction in a place like New York, which has the largest Jewish concentration of Jews outside of Israel.
Yeah, well, I'm not a New Yorker, but I've been following the race, and it's a problem when someone who's probably going to be the next mayor of New York, unless there's a coalition to oppose him, started a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter on his college, supports BDS, has said that he'll arrest Netanyahu if he comes to New York, is actively saying, Israel is not a Jewish state. That's a problem, considering that New York has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. That would make me very worried. And not just worried about New York, but I'm worried about the tenor within the Democratic Party. I grew up in a time that was probably the golden age for Jews in America. And both parties, were pro-Israel. Now it seems like the progressive camp is becoming more and more entrenched in the Democratic Party. And in fact, Obama's former OMB director, Peter Orszag, just wrote an op-ed saying the Democratic Party has an anti-Semitism problem. And that needs to be addressed because anti-Semitism left unchecked we've already seen it. We've seen people firebombed in Boulder, Colorado. We've seen 2 young people gunned down in the streets of Washington, D.C. These incidents, unfortunately, will continue without our leadership forcefully coming out against anti-Semitism, protecting the Jewish community. We have this, there's this myth that the Jews are powerful and that they're controlling parts of society. We are a tiny, tiny population, less than 2% of the American population. And, when people try to make the argument, well, I'm anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Jewish, I think that's a bunch of crap. If you know anything about the Jewish religion, you know that the land of Israel is integral to our religion. So most Jews are all Zionists. They believe that the land of Israel is where Jews should live. And I think that I interviewed Deborah Lipstadt, who was the former ambassador on anti-Semitism under Biden. And I asked her point blank, I said, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? She said, of course it is.
Absolutely. But there's hard behind that. You're also an attorney, but one of the things that I keep on hearing from these anti-Semites, these pro-Hamas demonstrators, free speech, free speech. You're not allowing us free speech, and they've gotten away with that. Even those that were arrested, like Khalid Muhammad, was gotten out, and they say free speech.
Yeah. So one thing that you learn in law school is that free speech has its limits. Okay, you can't walk into a crowded theater and shout fire. You don't have the ability to threaten people. And that's what's happening in many of these rallies. People are being threatened. The Jewish community, people that are on the fringes, people that are in the communities. I think that these rallies are meant to intimidate. Zev, I have a story for you. I have a friend's son who goes to Columbia, and he wears a kippah, and to walk to Columbia from his apartment, he has to pass through an encampment of If Not Now. And he said the number of times that he's been physically assaulted, verbally assaulted, and this is just to get to university. Now, imagine if you have a mayor who's not telling the police you need to protect the Jewish students. That's going to be a real problem in New York. And I think, it could be a problem in other places. I think we are a minority. People don't see us as a minority.
But we are.
But we are. And we feel it. And I think that you and I, we distinctly feel these days that we are a minority under attack.
No question about that. I know that you are speaking out, you're an activist, and we need more people speaking out, because a lot of Jews are complacent. And even in this past election in New York, where you see a known socialist and anti-Semite get the Democratic nod, is unfortunately we needed more Jewish activism, more Jews to vote, more Jews to participate. And we're lacking that, and it's a problem. We have to mobilize ourselves, become more active, not just say, let somebody else do it. We got to do it ourselves.
Right. And I think it's not just the Jews. I think it's our, non-Jews also. I mean, terrible things happen when people stay silent. It's a time for people to speak up. And, if anyone who's a student of history understands, once they force the Jews out of a community, that society always declines.
But let me ask this question, Jay. In New York race, a lot of the people that voted for Adami are young people. I don't think they were looking at anti-Semitism. They were looking to say free busing, free lunches, free rent, free. I mean, I joke, he was on a platform, free buses, free food, free supermarkets, free Palestine, everything is free. But I think a lot of them don't care about the anti-Semitism. They're just looking to see, how can I have this free stuff and this socialist propaganda and utopian universe, which doesn't exist, but they're buying into it because they want to buy into it. It's unrealistic.
Well, that may be. I'm not, following all of the economics of the race. I would just, my next question would be like, how are you going to pay for it? But exactly. But I would say that there's a narrative that's caught on where Israel and the Jewish community has lost the narrative. The narrative is that, Israel is a colonial power, that there were brown Palestinians occupying the land. Israelis came from, Jews came from Europe, and they colonized. It's a completely false narrative. There's always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. Jews come from all over the world, from the diaspora. My wife, her family is from India and from Iran. She certainly does not look white. If you go through, the streets of Israel, half of the people don't look white in Israel. And this is a political issue. This is a political issue that was attempted to be addressed by the British and the United Nations and the partition, and it's still a political issue. But I think where we've lost ground is that a false narrative has taken hold. And I think when you see the demographics of people that are voting for an anti-Semitic candidate, I think they fully believe that Israel is a colonial power. I think they think Israel's committing genocide, which is the farthest thing from the truth. I think our political leadership they're not leaders. They're looking at the polls and how can they continue to get reelected based on how their electorate sees things. I'll give you one example for term limits, which I think would be a good idea in the United States, because if you look at the history of the country was set up so that people served, and George Washington was the first example of you serve and then you go home and you go back to your farm or your business or your law firm or whatever you do. People were not meant to serve for 49 years in Congress. People weren't meant to stay in Congress until they had dementia. John Fetterman is a good example. Probably knows that he's not going to run for re-election, got elected, supports Israel, isn't backing off of it, isn't afraid. It's a good reason to have term limits.
By the way, I'd love him to stay on and some other people to leave, like Schumer, etc. Right. They wait way too long. In the few moments we have left, talk to me about your participation. I'm talking about the Ruderman Family Foundation and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee dealing with Malawi and Africa. Tell us about that initiative.
Yeah, so first of all, I've been involved with the Joint, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee for decades, and we've worked on disability inclusion in Israel. We started to look at other parts of the world that could really benefit from Jewish support and Israeli technology. And the program in Malawi, which started in Ghana, brings the latest Israeli technology to the most rural regions where there's very limited healthcare and people are dying at very young ages, and very simple technology like x-rays where someone can remotely read an x-ray from thousands of miles away and diagnose disease. And the whole reason to do this is to improve the image of Israel. Malawi is a very pro-Israel country. And I was recently there and I met with the president, and he set his remarks aside and he said, "This is a very emotional issue for me. I've always supported Israel. Our country has always supported Israel, but we don't get enough support back. And this is our attempt as a foundation to show support, to help them where they need help." And I think that, there's so many countries lined up against Israel. Africa is a young continent. And, the president told me that his neighbors are actively anti-Israel. He's taking a courageous stance by standing by Israel. And I think when we have friends and allies, we need to support them. And
I agree with you.
That's what we're doing.
Wasn't Israel, maybe this goes back a long time ago, I remember reading when I was younger that Israel was very much vested in Africa. Has that changed?
I don't think it's changed. I think it's being reinforced. Israel just opened an embassy in Zambia. I think that there are parts of Africa that are completely open. They understand that Israel can help bring technology and support that they're not getting from other parts of the world. And the Israeli technology, especially in medicine, is so much more advanced. So I think that there are great gains to be made in Africa, and I think Israel could do a lot to help the continent.
Well, thank you for facilitating that. Our guest has been activist Jay Ruderman, the author of the recently released book, Find Your Fight, Make Your Voice Heard for the Causes that Matter Most. I assume it's available on Amazon.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstores, wherever you get your books. I suggest people pick it up, and you'll learn something from it, and I think it'll help you.
He's also the host of the All About Change podcast, president of the Ruderman Family Foundation. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for what you're doing. I think we need more people to get involved. I'm hoping people will become more activists, become more active. We need that, especially during these times.
Thank you, Zev. I really appreciate it and wish you a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you for tuning in to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Anyway, thank you.